You are tuning into Teaching Trailblazers with Chris from Education to the Core. In this episode, we will be chatting with Dr. Hollins-Sims about equitable practices in the classroom. Dr. Hollins-Sims is a consultant with Pennsylvania State Department of Education, and she is an expert and a guru with incorporating equitable practices in the classroom and beyond. If this is your first time hearing about Education to the Core, you landed in the right spot. At ETTC, we want to make sure you not only have the best resources created by master teachers, but we want to be there every step of the way guiding you in your classrooms so you can not only be there for your students, but you can have a better work-life balance. Make sure to subscribe to the ETTC YouTube channel, like this video, and visit educationtothecore.com for tons of teaching tips, resources, and freebies, which are updated daily. Below this video, you will find the links for all that ETTC has to offer, as well as any links we may be discussing during this vlog. Welcome back, Teaching Trailblazers. You're tuning in to Teaching Trailblazers with Chris from ETTC. I am so lucky to be sitting here with Dr. Hollins-Sims, who is an expert and a guru with equity and equitable practices in the classroom. So, hello, Dr. Hollins-Sims. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. So excited to be here.
Oh, thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited to have you and kind of jump right in.
Sure.
So I would just love, before we really touch base and get into a really good dialogue of equity, we would just love to learn a little bit about you as an educator, how you kind of came into your role at Patton, as well as your heart and interest with equity.
Awesome. So I love to tell this story. I'm a school psychologist by training, and oftentimes in our role, we get relegated to testing and assessment. And part of our role is consultation as well. We're trained in that. And so I've been blessed to have the opportunity to expand the role of the school psychologist into more of the consultant role. So with that, I was able to help my school do PBIS, positive behavior interventions and support, and also focus on multi-tiered systems of support, or MTSS. And so that work led me to Patton. And so I've been serving as an educational consultant there, which is the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network. I've been there for approximately 7 years. During the time as a consultant at Patton supporting PBIS and MTSS, I was drawn to the work around significant disproportionality, in particular around discipline. And so we started a pilot in my work at Patton supporting a local school around PBIS being culturally responsive. And so part of my background also in school psychology is crisis response. So there have been a number of incidents across the Commonwealth post-2016 election that really lent themselves to addressing schools and students based on some of the outcomes that came out of that election, where students were holding signs or shouting derogatory things at each other, et cetera. And so I was drafted by PDE to come in and support some of the work to prevent and create more of a positive school climate in some of those sites. And so that led me into becoming special advisor to the Department of Education around equity, and realizing that equity is essentially everything we do. It's tied into every practice, and being able to provide students what they need at that right moment so that they get what they need and so that they have a successful educational career. So equity has really become my I would say best passion, because it lumps in all of the favorite things that I really enjoy about education and ensuring that the students who need the support the most are getting it.
Great. And kind of just for our kind of cross-country, other than Pennsylvania, and then worldwide of viewers. So Patton is kind of the leader of the training and technical assistance for the state of Pennsylvania. It kind of, and please jump in if I ever am incorrect with anything. So just kind of a little background knowledge of, they are kind of I would say like the big umbrella that supports all of our sections and regions that are broken up by intermediate units.
Got it.
So then they kind of provide the assistance and trainings to each of the IUs, the intermediate units, which then trickles down to districts, public and private and everything
Right. So we kind of call it a cascade model. So Chris, exactly what you described. And mainly the patent system is the training arm of the Bureau of Special Education through the Department of Ed. And so our goal and our drive is around making sure we ensure the best practices for students with disabilities. However, we know that a lot of general education practices are influenced by what we do in the special education world. And so PBIS and MTSS are directly connected to those specific groups. And so, yeah, you nailed it. Patent is the training arm, and we help to make sure that that good work gets out across the Commonwealth, and we hope the country.
Well, great. I'm glad, I passed that test, and that was
Yes, you did.
we're good now for the rest of the time. I'm like, okay, I'm good now. I got my one and done, and it was early on today, so
Perfect.
no promises what's going to be coming up. So when we talk about equity, I guess I think some educators, and like myself even included, kind of where do we draw the line of what does it mean by like equity and like what does it really mean by equality? Kind of like what's that fine difference, if any?
So that is an excellent question. And I think as we think about what equity means, that's a foundational underpinning that needs to be understood. So oftentimes we hear people say, well, we treat everyone equally. And that is intention is so good with that. However, when we treat everyone equally, we're giving them all the exact same thing. And we know that we're all very different. We all present with different strengths and needs. And so equity really speaks to being able to address those strengths and needs in a very intentional way so that we can ensure students are able to, for instance, one of the key things with equity is access. So they have access and opportunity to a variety of things, whether that's an educational space, whether that's content, whether that's technology. So equity really lends itself to being able to make sure that those needs are addressed so that they have the same types of chances that everyone else has in the educational system.
That's really interesting. And you kind of were saying, because I think a lot of times in education and educators in general, when we hear the word equity, we automatically go to race.
Yes, sir.
And I feel, and I think as we continue this dialogue, you can't talk about equity without possibly ruffling some feathers, really talking about some difficult stuff. And I just want to kind of, I don't want to say like a disclaimer in a way, but I know Dr. Hollins-Sims and I, we're really here to kind of discuss some of those things openly and kind of have some of these tough dialogues and conversations. And I know I spoke with her briefly once before and I said it and I'll say it again. Please, if at any time I ever say anything incorrectly or inappropriately, she's going to call me out on it. And just
And
so,
I say the same for you.
yeah.
Mhm.
It is because I think it's a learning experience for all of us. And as we continue these dialogues, I think our viewers and us will kind of know exactly what we mean by that.
Yeah, so I'm glad that you pinpointed the discussion about equating equity and race and assuming that that is the only kind of avenue that you can have these discussions. Because what we find in the field, I've had certain places where I go and train on this say, well, we don't have a lot of racial differences. So why do we need to talk about equity? What's the point? But you have students with disabilities, you have students who are homeless, you may have students that have a different class, whether that's socioeconomic status or even homeless. And so all of those different cultures need to be addressed and their needs need to be addressed, going back to the key definition of equity. So things that are in your face, such as race, can be some of those starting conversations to really start to unpack our own self-awareness. So where our biases might be, where our privileges might be, or even the powers that we have. And I think it's important to note that we all have those things in our various roles and in our various identities. So for instance, there's white privilege, There's heterosexual privilege. There is religious privilege. For certain people, Christianity is seen as the religion of the country. And so other religions may not be able to say and do the same things that Christians are able to say and do in America. And so those are things that we need to be aware of as we engage with students. When we do things like holiday celebrations, that's why there's such a focus on that, because sometimes we ignore some of the other religions or celebratory moments that other students present with, and we don't do it intentionally. That's what I'm finding across the country, and in Pennsylvania in particular. There's a lot of good intentions in what we do, but it's becoming more aware of how we can become more responsive to students and to families that are very different from us.
And I think you really bring up a good point of just that awareness
Hmm.
of your own, biases and, your own privilege. I hear a lot of times kind of just playing that, both sides on the fence type of thing of hearing people, well, I had a tough life and, I turned out just fine. And I'm like, but yes. But even just for myself, I mean, I grew up low SES, um, working since, young teenage, but again, it's through, I can still recognize just being Caucasian, just being white. I have white privilege, and being a white
Hmm.
male, just alone, the privilege that brings. So it's
Hmm.
still just recognizing that, okay, yeah, there's different things that we all have to overcome, but we still can fall back of, wow, I didn't have that battle just because of the color of my skin.
Correct. And I think, Chris, you make a good point, because sometimes when we talk about something like white privilege or just privilege in general, people get very defensive because they internalize it and say, well, I don't do that, or I didn't have that experience. How can you call me privileged? And really, when we think about privilege, we have to take it outside of ourselves and think more on a societal level, because it is more society than it is an internal person. So it speaks to what you just articulated, that, some people don't have to worry about if they walk in a room and they're the only person of color, because that's not an issue for them. Folks that are not of color have the privilege of being in spaces a lot of times that are predominantly white or predominantly Christian or predominantly heterosexual, and they don't have to be aware of those things. It's like swimming in the water. You don't know the water's dirty because you swim in it all the time. So it's those ways of being able to leverage your privilege. So you shouldn't be ashamed of the privilege. You shouldn't feel guilty for the privilege. It's how do you leverage it to ensure that those that don't have it get some of those opportunities that you've been afforded simply because society allows that to happen. So I think that's really important to designate that it's not a personal attack when we talk that type of language.
Thank you. And thank you for that kind of reassurance. And again, that mindfulness of kind of, having that discussion of it and identifying it in yourself.
Hmm.
I kind of want to just take what we're kind of talking about of kind of this white privilege and, it's not ashamed and all this other stuff. But when we kind of cross over this line, and I think you alluded to it in your very early career with Patton in recent years with like the 2016 election,
Correct.
there was kind of like a viral moment in a local school district
Hmm.
that could you kind of speak to that a little bit of kind of like what happened and then kind of how you addressed it? I think it's a really fascinating.
Sure. So that incident, as I mentioned, happened maybe days after the election results. And the students at that particular school, this was a career tech center, they were walking through the halls with the former president's name on the signs that they were carrying. And as they walked through, they were shouting things like, "Go back to Mexico, we're building the wall, white power," etc. That was recorded by someone's phone, and then it went viral, made national news, etc. Students that were, I guess, exposed to that event, that were Black, brown, white, just offended by the event, wanted to stage a sit in. And so I was called in along with members of our Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, PHRC. So if you're not familiar with that group, they come in and support schools and districts if complaints are made about civil rights. And so they came in and they offer trainings and support. And so we were kind of in a collaborative spirit, trying to support that particular school. And one of the things I learned from that event, because the sit-in was that day when we were there, was that it's important for students to feel heard. So sometimes cliche will say, oh, student voice is so important, but in incidents like this, it truly cannot be understated, because student voice really tells us what is it that students want us to know, and they oftentimes have a solution or an idea on how things could shift or change because they know themselves and they know what works for them. So it was one of those things where, in talking to the principal, I said, the folks who organize the sit-in, they're the leaders of this group. Call them in, hear from them, and listen. Try not to get defensive. Try not to say, well, we're doing this, and that in response. Just sit and take it in. Because at the end of the day, most times people just want to be heard and feel that their voice has value. And once the principal did that, that's not to say that everything became rainbows and pretty after that. But what it said to the students was that we value you and we want to know how to do better. And so they were able to build on that, and the sit-in dispersed. So again, it sounds easy, it's not, but those are the little things that really make a difference, is listening to the young people when they're expressing their displeasure or even their experiences, validating those experiences for them is really critical.
Mhm. And just that active listening is
Mhm.
so important. It's such a great strategy, like for so many things, like the
Right.
behavior, the like trauma informed practices. Like it's such
Got it.
it's a great little niche for like each of those buzzwords and those areas of. It's such a powerful tool that educators and just people in general could really have.
Absolutely. Totally agree. And if more would do it, I think we would be at different places. So just to give you context, we're post 2020 election. We've had a number of incidents, not only with COVID, we had the racial reckoning summer. Now we're at the post election and the insurrection. Like, so many things have happened, and students need space to talk about that and to understand what's happening. And you and I talked, Chris, at some length about how uncomfortable those conversations can really be. And especially as teachers, like trying to navigate all of the different perspectives that might be shared or expressed. How do you navigate that? And I think one of the things that's important, and one of the websites that I would always recommend going to, it used to be called Teaching Tolerance. It's now called learningforjustice.org. And I would say, if you need any support or some quick step processes on how to navigate difficult conversations, that is a great resource. K to 12. They have learning plans where you can find different lessons on how to engage in this work and even talk through some of those really difficult topics. And so one of the ones that I shared post the insurrection was titled When Bad Things Happen. And essentially, there's 4 steps to that. One is to listen, which we've said now is such a big key thing. The other is to protect. So you will have students who are exposed to all different types of news sources, all different types of information being thrown at them, protecting them in the sense of being able to help them understand good news versus not so good news, versus how to take that information and be a little bit more critical about it. And then I said protect. So listen, protect, model. So modeling kind of how you want those discussions to go, creating the safety in that space to have those discussions. And then lastly, take care of yourself, because we all have our own perspectives that we're coming in with. We may have had a trauma from some of the things we're discussing, whether it's a hurricane or an active shooter or what have you. So the article really articulates quickly 4 steps to really think about how those conversations could be shaped. So I would definitely recommend that as something, especially in the times that we're in, to engage in those brave conversations.
Yeah. And I think that's where, especially in like, as you said, like the current times of, this past summer and most recently the insurrection, is I really feel, and I see it a lot on social media, as soon as it happened, like one teacher would bring up like, hey, like I'm thinking about kind of having this dialogue and like, sharing some pieces with my class. And then but then other educators are like, there's no way that I am touching this
Sure.
with a 10-foot pole. And you kind of just said it right here. It's like one of those things of how important student voice is. And I know personally, as soon as that happened, the first thing I did was talk to my partner and spouse and say, hey, like, this is what's going on. Like, what do you think of this? And, we watched the news together and we talked about it. So,
Right.
and then I immediately spoke to my mother. And, that was one of the first things that we talked about too was, hey, can you believe this is happening type of thing. So as adults, we automatically share and talk and go to our friends or go to a safe space to have these discussions. Whether you're supporting it or you're against it, you still go to that support group.
You got it.
So I think it's really kind of important of, why couldn't we and why wouldn't we have these discussions in our classrooms?
Yeah, I can sense, why there might be some hesitation, but I'm with you. I'm all for it. Like, we have to talk. If we don't have the conversations, who will type thought. But I think I shared with you that there are some teachers who expressed, and I get it, that are virtual and they're teaching a virtual space. And so you don't know if parents can hear or if they'll offer some input. And how do you protect? Going back to that four step, how do you protect everyone in your classroom, whether that's a virtual classroom or not? And so you have to be cognizant of that. So I'm not saying that should deter you in any way from having the conversations, but being aware that some of those things may happen and what can you do to safeguard not only yourself, but also the protection of the students as you navigate that space. It's something to just have as food for thought.
Mhm. And I thank you so much for kind of offering those four steps. And
Mhm.
it's really important because I was really keen on, kind of like that first and fourth step of, listening, but then also that self-care piece is so
Yes, sir.
important to me. And I kind of touch base on everything I do with education to the core. There's always like a little self-care piece tied into that. But I love the protection step as well as the modeling. I think those are really key steps of kind of having that total package in a way.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So kind of a little bit kind of going back to like the sit-in and like how you first started of really active listening. Are there any other general equity practices that you would recommend? Like where's like a good starting point for teachers, do you feel?
Great question. So, the Pennsylvania Department of Education in September of 2020 released the PDE Equitable Practices Hub. I was so excited to see that finally get released because it felt like a labor of love. So, earlier, Chris, you highlighted that in our work, we work with intermediate units in our Commonwealth. And so, a lot of the equity points of contact from those intermediate units help to build out the hub. And essentially, what we wanted out of it was to be a one stop shop because with everything related to equity, there's so many resources out there. We wanted to try to organize those resources in a way so that teachers, administrators, families, etc., could find things very easily and know that those resources are appropriate for what it is that you wish to do. And so the hub is actually organized into six pillars. And really quickly, I'm just going to rattle them off. So the first pillar is general equity practices, which are real global systemic type practices like hiring, adopting like PBIS as a framework, those big things that districts and schools can do. The second is self awareness. So we've talked about bias, power, privilege. That's what that pillar represents, unpacking that, understanding who we are. Number three is data practices. So, as teachers, what is your data telling you in your classroom? Whether that's grades, whether that's universal screening data, like if you do something like Acadience or formerly Dibbles, what does that data look like? And which students are not being responsive to what it is you have in place? That's data practices through an equitable lens. Number four is family and community engagement, key in equity because families and communities, speaking about that active listening, the only way we're going to know if we've been responsive to them is to gain that engagement and input from them. So that is such a critical pillar. And then the last two, one is academic equity and the other is disciplinary equity. Academic equity is that access and opportunity. So access to curriculum, access to culturally responsive practices in the classroom. Having the experience, and I shared this with you earlier, of mirror windows and sliding doors. So students that look different or have different experiences can see themselves in a mirror, whatever that content is, but also can see outside of a window and have the experience of others and be able to take perspective. The sliding door allows them to go back and forth. So come in and out of the door to either see in or see out. And so academic equity is a very broad pillar, but it encompasses a lot of the pedagogy that has to take place. And then lastly is disciplinary equity. And that's where you see things like PBIS, school climate, reduction in suspension and expulsion. How can we make those climates more positive and responsive to students of color, students with disabilities, and the list goes on, students who identify as transgender, etc. We want students to have a safe place to have their education happen. So that's the 6 pillars. Then as you go through the pillars, you can go through each pillar based on your role. So there's a school and district section, there's a classroom section, and there's an individual section. So for teachers, you may spend most of your time in the classroom sections to really get a grip on what does equity look like for me in particular in my classroom. But then if you want to do more of an internal dive, you may go to the individual space to get a little bit more, again, individualized supports around equity. So the hub has been designed for teachers, for administrators, for any educator to enhance their equitable practices or even begin the journey towards equity in their system.
And I have to say thank you to you and your team with this hub. I've experienced it. I went through it. It is very, very teacher friendly.
Awesome.
Speaking from an educator side of things, but then also kind of on the flip side of just an individual aspect of how much I appreciated it, because it really kind of opens up your eyes of, kind of just those 6 pillars you said, of just focusing in. You might be spending a lot of time classroom wise on the academics and disciplinary, but then you're really pulling pieces from the individual side of things in self-awareness,
Right.
or kind of the family and community sections.
Mhm.
So it's not like, okay, well, I'm a classroom teacher, I need to stick with classroom for each one.
You got it.
It can kind of be, you can kind of pull and take from each one, depending on, is this something you sit on a team of kind of school climate and you want to look at it from a district perspective
Mhm.
of making it more, acceptable and access to everything. You can kind of look at it from that lens. But then also, like you said, like we just talked about, it was just kind of trickling down too. So it's really a wealth of knowledge. And thank you. Kind of gave a wonderful little overview of each of the pillars and what they each have to offer. So
Thank you. Like I think that feedback is so critical to hear you speak to it as a classroom teacher and how it can be user friendly. That was our purpose and goal. So that really makes me happy. And I'm sure that the folks that helped build it will be so ecstatic to know that teachers are finding the utility in it, because that definitely is what we want. You guys are you keep everything moving in systems. So if teachers are not feeling like it's actually for them, it's all for naught because you keep the machine moving.
I kind of gave this analogy in like one of our own team meetings like a couple of weeks ago, of kind of sitting on the outside of the pool and just kind of throwing things in at them to see if they'll take. Like,
Right.
I think, we kind of need something equity, but like, okay, well, you don't know if it's going to work, but let's just throw it in there, see if it takes a bite. And honestly, like it was a good one. Like it was a
Good.
really good catch. I know just from looking at it, you really listened to what teachers were looking for
Mhm.
when designing this. And you can tell you had a lot of teachers' input and kind of the take from it. And I hope the feedback is also similar moving forward too.
I hope so too. We're hoping that it continues to grow, but it's also not just a resource dump, because sometimes it can become overwhelming even with all of those vetted resources. So we're trying to be as intentional as possible so that it doesn't become overwhelming to people as they navigate it. And that's the feedback that we would be looking for any user that has accessed that. Please let us know how it's landing for you. That's the only way we can get better.
Absolutely. And I think it's one of those things that it's not anything new.
Right.
Equity is not new.
Nope.
Um, and it's not going away anytime soon. It's not one of those buzzwords that it's like, okay, it's the hot topic, let's talk about it for a year, and then it's going to dissipate and go back to the back burner.
Thank you for that.
I think it's just one of those things where more people are talking about it in recent years, just because of just exposure of like media, social media. But then also, I think on the flip side and the more positive side, a lot of educators are making their classrooms more accessible and safer.
Yes.
So students are having these dialogues of, for example, talking about pronouns, and kind of, for example, like maybe they are identified as female, but they prefer they, them pronouns. So it's kind of being cognizant of, okay, well, this is just something that they are feeling, very appreciative and, kind of proud about, and they wanted to be identified as such. So it's making that fourth effort of, okay, not identifying from how you are perceiving them, but, how they truly identify.
You got it. Got it. And that's so critical. And it's sometimes an overlooked space when we talk about equity. So I'm glad that you brought that up, because oftentimes this goes back to the previous conversation we were having about sometimes race being equated to equity. And there's so many other groups of students that we need to be responsive to. Because to your point, Chris, we talk about mental health, we talk about trauma. And one of the things that we know to be true, unfortunately, is the suicide risk for a lot of our young people that have different backgrounds, and those numbers continuing to spike. So what can we do in our systems to create spaces where they have a sense of belonging? And one of the key definitions about belonging that I don't want to neglect is that it allows the student not only to feel welcomed, but that they can be their authentic selves in that space. And that sometimes is the missing piece of that definition that I don't think we always are aware of, that people need to feel safe enough to be themselves, and that they won't be seen as a stereotype or treated differently simply because of the differences they present with. So I'm appreciative of you sharing about pronouns, because that is a small step on being responsive and equitable in practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And you kind of bring up a good point too of, um, just being like their own self, and not just being, I don't want to use this word inappropriate, but like the token.
Yes.
It's like, okay, I predominantly white, high school, like an area that I grew up in, and we had one family, and thank goodness, and shout out to Mercedes if you're watching. We're still friends to this day, and unfortunately, like she would joke around, and she goes, okay, I'm the token black, I get it. Same thing for me. I was, the token out kid in high school. And okay, it's the one gay kid that, is, hey, there he is walking down the hall. Like, it's like one of those things of, it's just, okay. It's one of those, open that dialogue, open that space to kind of have these conversations of being people's true selves. And I feel we're getting better in education, but we're not there yet.
Right. There's always room to grow. One of the things I say in training this is that equity is a journey and not a destination. And so there's no finish line, if you will, because we're constantly learning. So remember, we talked about if we say something inappropriate, we'll call each other out. That's needed because we're constantly learning new experiences and new things about people. So we never have all of the answers. And that's part of what we call cultural humility. We don't have all the answers. We don't know everything about everyone, but we're humble enough to be willing to learn. And I think if we can adopt that type of mantra, we will continue to see some of those changes. And one thing really quick about the whole token, I think it's so important to also say that that person, that individual person or that individual family is not the spokesperson for that entire group. And I think that's so critical to remember, that transgender people are not a monolith. People that identify as gay are not a monolith. Black people are not a monolith. The list can go on. And so it's again about that individual having the opportunity to be themselves in the way that they have been brought up, in the way that they've lived, and not feel the pressure of representing an entire group.
Great. And kind of like as we're leading towards like kind of like the end of like this discussion dialogue of, and we kind of touched base a little bit about it of kind of as we are going along this whole dialogue of kind of how well this fits into so many systems and classrooms and programs that we currently have. So I don't want educators feeling like, okay, well, this is just another thing added to my list.
Correct.
Like, great, this is a whole nother lesson. This is something like I'm going to have to add. And it's not. It's just looking at it through a different lens. It's already what you're implementing, just looking at it a little differently. It's the same way how I describe it when I lead development on trauma informed.
Yep.
It's the same thing. It's nothing new. It's just adding a little piece to how you're doing it
Yes.
and kind of just keeping it in the back of your mind of every single lesson that you do. Okay, am I being, do I have a focus on trauma? Do I have a focus on equity?
Yeah.
And then just doing you, like you do you, but it's just through this lens.
That's right. I'm so appreciative of you saying that because so often we get educators across the nation, like it's not specific, but it happens. People feel like, oh, this is a list I have to follow or a prescription that I have to follow. And so I can't put too much energy here because I got to focus on this. And I appreciate you giving the lens approach. It's taking off the glasses, taking on the glasses, keeping the glasses on, and maybe shifting the colors of the glasses every now and then. So I think that's really critical, Chris, that you're articulating for people. It's not new, number one. And it just means you may have to adjust a little bit, but it doesn't mean you have to stop everything to do something different. It's just being more responsive to the needs.
Well, thank you. And like, we just like to add to this too, it's one of those mindset changes.
Yeah.
It's just a change of mindset. We can't change overnight,
No.
nor do I think our students are expecting us to. I think it's one of those just being open to kind of that self, like the critique of, the correct, allowing your students to correct you even in dialogue of sometimes, a slip of the tongue of, in the incorrect pronoun again, of just allowing them to be like, oh, no, or having that comfortability of coming up to you afterwards, like, you kind of called me he again during class, can we please be a little bit more mindful of it? So it's kind of just a practice that we have to continually do, I think.
I agree. I wholeheartedly agree with that. And I hear a lot of people say, well, I don't know what to say. So I'm afraid of making a mistake. So I just don't say anything. And sadly, silence can equal complicity. So we don't necessarily want that. So if you're willing to be vulnerable enough to make a mistake and have someone correct you, that's another key skill with active listening that is so critical. So you just said it perfectly, probably better than me. But but it is one of those things that you really just have to be willing to accept the correction and also willing to make a mistake because we're going to do it. It's human. We can't help that.
Absolutely. And I think just in education in general, sometimes it's those teachable moments
You
of
got it.
when we make mistakes, we can practice, we can model to our students like, hey, I just did this. How can I fix it? What do we do? Brainstorm together. And that's one of those teachable moments right in the moment there of, hey, can take your lesson soaring.
Exactly. Yep. And then everybody wins because them seeing you accept the correction, make the change, allows and gives permission for everyone else in the space to do the same.
Well, Dr. Hollins-Sims, thank you so much for your time and this conversation. I always say, like, we can talk hours and hours and keep going.
Right.
But if people are really interested in like learning more or they have questions, could they possibly reach out to you, and kind of what's the best avenue for that?
Absolutely. So my email address is the best place, and that is nhollins, Hollins hyphen Sims, Sims, at Patton, Pattan, .net. And you can also follow me on Twitter if you'd like, at Dr. Nicole H. Sims, all together. So please follow me on Twitter. You can communicate there with me, but email is probably the best place if you have a specific question.
Sounds great. Well, thank you. And I'll definitely include kind of all your contact info with
Please do.
this vlog,
Mhm.
but more importantly, also the links to the hub. I think that's really going to pique a lot of viewers' interest, and it's
Perfect.
such a great resource. And I think, and it's again, it's not just for Pennsylvania, correct?
Right.
It's not just
Nope.
for PA teachers,
Nope.
which I mean, PA teachers, I would, if you don't already know about this, you heard it right here, people. This is
Yes.
it. Um, but I think every educator and person will get a lot out of that too. So,
I hope so.
well, thank you again so much, Dr. Hollins-Sims, I truly, truly appreciate your time that you gave us this afternoon. And I can't wait for educators and people to watch this one.
I'm so excited. And thank you, Chris, for the opportunity to talk.
Absolutely. Would love to have you back again if you're interested sometime soon and
I love it.
continue this conversation and
Sounds
more.
good. Yes.
Sounds good. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in, and we'll see you again real soon. Thank you, Teaching Trailblazers of Education to the Core, for joining Dr. Hollins-Sims and me, Chris, for equity practices in the classroom and beyond. Please make sure to like and share this video, as well as subscribe to this YouTube channel. We will be meeting with more teachers across all disciplines for support, strategies, and engaging activities that you can implement in your own classrooms. We would also love to hear from you in the comments down below. This channel and Education to the Core is all about helping you grow in your profession and to build this community together. Remember, be kind and be strong. I hope to see you again soon. Thanks.